Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. We're in the midst of the fourth turning, inflections in long-term societal cycles, and the ending era of the Great Moderation. All around us, we are witnessing changes in America and around the world that only 10 years ago would have seemed unimaginable. Whether we're talking about changing cultural attitudes towards wokeism, to LGBTQI+, media censorship, or DEI and ESG, or open borders and expanding government controls, the list of proof of changes is everywhere to be seen. The financial markets are no different, with initiatives like QE, QT, yield curve control, central bank lending facilities, massive RRP operations, and the list goes on here also. There is a sense that the system is in trouble and breaking down. Falling public confidence is endemic as political wrangling reaches levels never before seen in American history. In fact, we may face a presidential election where both candidates are either under criminal charges or being threatened by the other party to soon be charged. What can we make of this? If you want a political or policy discussion on all of this, then this is not where you're going to find it. We at Madasi.com are investors, not social warriors nor advocates of a particular political policy. However, as investors, we can't live under a rock, as these issues materially affect our investment thinking going forward. We're going to touch on some of this as it regards the changing role of central banks and the new forcing functions they're facing. These are forcing functions that will have potentially profound changes going forward and to your portfolio. As such, I will address the subjects outlined here. The purpose of a central bank is most fundamentally to ensure adequate funding of the country, whether it's financial or industrial corporations, consumers, or governments of all levels, federal, regional, state, or local. Since the government, or the G, of a country are completely supported by the output of individuals and corporations, it is the effective productivity of those two that monetary policy must address through its mandates of price stability and full employment. However, monetary policy must also accommodate government's fiscal and public policy, which in concert are additionally intended to address the productive needs of consumers and corporations. This works well in a capitalist system until the government becomes too big a part of the economy. Its fiscal and public policies impede financing and or simply pull too much available resources away from productive investments. Then the role of monetary policy becomes increasingly focused on simply the financing of the government. The I for investment is primarily about attracting foreign investment to finance mass debt levels and the government transfer payments to finance an increasing social entitlement net. The GDP formula becomes highly distorted in that GDP becomes ineffective in actually measuring the productive growth of a nation. The U.S. and many of the developed nations have reached this critical point. If the current system is to be sustained, the two areas in the red circles must be addressed, most likely in a fashion that few recognize or are willing to accept today. We'll come back to this slide a little later, but first we need to understand some realities facing global central bankers, or I don't think you'll accept the conclusions that we're starting to draw. Corporations, investors, and consumers expect the economy to run in a balanced and stable manner, fostering an increasing standard of living. The growth of the central bank balance sheet runs in concert with expanding asset values, productivity, and standards of living. However, that ideal hasn't existed since the U.S. came off the gold standard in 1972, and trade balances at that point went into deficits as the U.S. increasingly consumed more than it produced over the last 50 years. A growing shell game has increasingly existed. All the never-before contemplated QE versions and other games have been used to keep the house of cards from folding. The growth of debt and the central bank balance sheets to accommodate it have grown at truly unimaginable rates since the dot-com bubble implosion. What I find interesting is no one asks why nor seems to care much. On the surface, there are some quick answers, like is shown at the bottom, where the advent of EU and the ECB propelled the eurodollar. the Federal Reserve's reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, or the global reaction to COVID. To some degree, many could ask if this is a chicken or an egg question. Did one cause the other, or the needed response to the other? If we look at the blue line, we see that the ECB has required simply massive growth in debt since the 2008 financial crisis to sustain the overall EU's fragile banking system, weakening industrial prowess, and onerous social entitlement programs. Ukraine and the accompanying Russian energy dependency would suggest the EU would be the biggest financial backers of the Ukraine war, but they're not. The geographically and energy-removed US and UK, amongst others, are. Is it lack of desire and the politics involved, or simply that it's unable to finance more? The Federal Reserve's balance sheet in red has clearly exploded to a new rate of increase since COVID-19. The Bank of Japan and the People's Bank of China, though increasingly, appear relatively more tempered since COVID. However, that can be misinterpreted, since on a GDP basis, Japan clearly has experienced a massive debt increase as basically the Japanese sovereign debt market has been nationalized. Clearly, continuing to increase debt at these rates was going to become problematic before the Great Moderation came to an end. This year's Matasi thesis paper outlined this in detail, so for more detail, I'll refer you to our website. The ending of the era of Great Moderation has already resulted in dramatically higher inflation rates. The policy reactions to COVID were clearly an initial driver to this, but the fact that the debt levels were taken to such levels and attributed to COVID is not valid. The American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the list goes on with climate change, green energy, and other initiatives that blew fiscal spending through the debt ceiling and the Fed balance sheet to over $9 trillion. This was not about COVID. This was about keeping the debt machine from failing to deliver sufficient debt to keep the machine running. The end of the era of moderation now means slowing globalization, which has been delivering low import costs due to labor arbitrage, slowing financialization, which has delivered ever smaller debt carrying costs, and slowing mercantilism, which has delivered the financing of U.S. debt and a strong U.S. dollar, and now resulting in increasing risk premiums in the form of debt duration premia and equity premiums. So what are the central banks currently doing about these forcing functions? They're currently consumed with trying to get the inflation genie back in the bottle, as rightly so. A battle they're not yet winning when understood properly. The Federal Reserve has long used the core PCE to gauge inflation, since even former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh has stated the administration's BLS data can no longer be trusted. This Federal Reserve graphic shows that the core PCE is dramatically above the long-term downward Great Moderation trend line, and still at levels not seen since the Great Inflation era of the 1970s and the Volcker era. What is a major concern is that despite massive increases in the Fed funds rate at an unprecedented rate, it is not coming down anywhere near fast enough. This is the Fed balance sheet going back to the dot-com bubble implosion and highlighting the dramatic surge since the U.S. abandoned any charade of fiscal responsibility with COVID-19. We overlay on it the Fed fund rate increase relative to it. We have never experienced this level of rate on this level of debt. As an aside, it shows that debt interest financing payments is the obvious short-term problem with the central bank's current fight against inflation, and everyone else holding adjustable rate debt or needing to borrow. Here we overlay the core PCE. The good news is, though the core PCE may not have come down a great deal, at least the Fed funds rate has risen sufficiently to close on it. Remember, the Fed funds rate must be above the core PCE if we have any chance of getting the inflation rate under control. What might we not know is what the Fed chooses not to tell us. First, the bad news, and then the good news. The bad news is the Fed actually uses a modified version of the core PCE. It's called the trimmed mean PCE inflation rate. It is an alternative measure of core inflation in the price index for personal consumption expenditure. It is calculated by staff at the Dallas Fed using data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It shows more volatility, as can be seen on this Fed graphic on the right, measured on the shortest degree changes. Here we overlay it on our previous chart with some required smoothing for clarity. We suddenly see that using the trimmed version that the Fed's PCE, their own preferred view, is much worse than currently perceived. There are reasons why the Fed uses it, which I won't go into here. But one way to view its importance to them is against the Federal Reserve balance sheet. You can see that there is a delayed correlation between the Fed balance sheet growth and the trimmed mean core PCE. The Fed can isolate with some degree of measure its balance sheet growth or shrinkage with the delay and level of the core PCE. It would appear that the Fed policy planners know they must get its balance sheet down and rates up further if it is to achieve its stated inflation goal. That's the bad news. Now the good news most are still unaware of. Fisher's equation tells us that nominal rates are equal to the addition of the real interest rate and the expected inflation-deflation rate. Whether the 10-year bond rate to finance the government or the Fed funds rate, the equation is the same adjusted for the appropriate duration. What does this mean? It means since the real rate, which has been steadily rising in 2023 because of central bank actions, if maintained, and that is a big if, then it will help the central bank's efforts in closing the gap towards fighting inflation. How that is happening is that the U.S. CPI fixing swaps shows that even if the Fed holds the rate steady, slowing inflation ensures the real rate will rise the equivalent of 5 more rate hikes by late summer or 8 by next April. Meanwhile, global real policy rates are now flat and will soon be firmly positive as inflation keeps falling. The trick will be to keep central bank rates on hold or higher for the remainder of 2023, or as long as it can. We now need to switch subjects slightly and talk about the U.S. dollar. Though the U.S. dollar is under attack because of shrinking foreign exchange needs and de-dollarization due to the ineffective use of weaponizing the dollar as an instrument of foreign policy, it is still the global currency of choice. There are many reasons for this, which I've outlined in recent newsletters as a counterbalance to my 2019 thesis paper entitled De-Dollarization, which spelled out the whole notion before, frankly, anyone was even writing about it. The bottom line is that the U.S. dollar is required for balance of payments to ensure current account balances equal to financial and capital accounts ledgers for countries that are dealing together. To see the importance of this, let's look at an example of a country like Vietnam. Like many countries, it has net imports from China. Its imports are larger from China than its exports, and therefore no Chinese currency surplus is injected into Vietnam. This is not unusual. Nor is the fact that Vietnam exports to the U.S. dwarf its imports from the U.S. The result is a surge in U.S. dollars, which enables Vietnam, through their fractional reserve banking system, to have its banks finance massive amounts of economic growth. Until China or any other country actually replaces the U.S. in becoming a net exporter destination, the U.S. dollar will be around and very important. The country will have to be running a massive deficit, as the U.S. is, to replace the dollar. This doesn't mean the dollar won't continue to erode. This is because a large number of countries are net exporters of commodities and are increasingly having positive net trade balances with China. This creates yuan bank balances to finance growth. This is why China, through its Belt Road Initiative, BRIC Alliance, and Shanghai Accord, are binding commodity players together in a massive way as an alternative to the U.S. dollar. Why is this important? Because the U.S. and developed economies are increasingly experiencing pressures on maintaining their GDP levels. This chart of the U.S. shows a steady lowering of its GDP level. We are clearly entering a recession, which will bring disinflation and deflationary pressures with it for a short period of time, and also a compression of a possible reversal of the wealth effect. No doubt, lowering rates will be needed to combat a worsening or protracted hard landing, and central banks will be forced politically to react accordingly. The real question is, how does it get back out of it without it reigniting inflation? It will need growth, but not at the expense of excess debt creation as it's done previously. The problem is more clearly shown when we understand that U.S. GDP normally approximates the 5-year U.S. Treasury note. It is shown here in gold. It diverged since the 2008 financial crisis due to quantitative easing, which has inevitably resulted in inflation. The current 5-year note approximates 4% today, with GDP growth below 2%. After the recession, the target for GDP will likely need it to be forced up towards 2% or much higher. That level of GDP suggests that the 5-year note will need to approximate 5%. The benchmark 10-year note, added in turquoise, will also need to be in this range, maybe higher or slightly lower depending on demand and inflation expectations. Therefore, we're going to see higher rates for a sustained period of time if we're going to get this kind of GDP. But how do you do that? Central banks and governments are going to need a new approach to get growth up without inflation creating stimulus and sustained low rates. But the problem is much more complex. There are many more forcing functions at play. There is the Triffin paradox that says the world growth or GDP is dependent on the expansion of the U.S. deficit for its financing, as we discussed earlier. A U.S. problem is a world problem, and a global problem is a U.S. problem. As an offshoot of the Triffin paradox, the expansion of the euro-dollar system must be maintained. The coming recession can't be allowed to be protracted or take us into a depression or experience a global recession. The U.S. consumer is tapped out, and a major reverse wealth effect occurring is a real possibility. A 70% consumption-dependent economy has never experienced a situation where the consumer has suddenly become seriously destabilized and has the inability to maintain even its current level of consumption. We have a global derivative structure that is on the cusp, with global interests and currency swaps alone at 7 to 8 times the size of the global economy. Any shock or disruption here and the problem may not be able to be contained. So there's a very, very difficult balancing act in a world which is not coordinated nor in full agreement on almost anything. What is the plan? Is there one? Will we just plunge into some abyss? No one knows for sure, but it appears the answer will take the form of the following, because these are the things that are happening, whether by plan or whether by control of some of these forcing functions. I said earlier I'd return to this slide. To get GDP up to 3 to 4% without using the single, increasingly destructive tool of fiscal stimulus as the only tool, and more debt, it must additionally solve the problem of the export-import problem on the right. We've concluded this will mean governments will be forced to become increasingly more of a regulatory or administrative state. Mandates, restrictions, controls will increasingly be the order of the day, things that we've become accustomed to over the last 3 years since COVID. 84,000 new IRS agents, armed IRS agents, postal workers, and other federal agencies. A new FBI building larger than the Pentagon won't in the future draw the attention they currently are. The government will begin to guarantee credit, debt, and loans in the form of what accountants call contingent liability accounting. This will be seen to foster growth without inflation. This is almost a given as the way out. Additionally, modern monetary theory can be expected to increasingly replace Keynesian economics. We think we're going to see nationalization and conservatorships in a much larger and broader fashion. But this is going to result in lower standard of living, which is already occurring in real disposable income and the way inflation is eating at our standard, along with expectations of what the standard of living will be. We think that open borders are not a coincidence. I'm seeing over 6 million people in here illegally and being accelerated will lead to, and for other reasons, universal basic income and domestic onshoring production and increasing reductions of foreign supply chains. Maybe that's why we have open borders, because we're going to need much cheaper labor in increasing reindustrialization of America as we do this reshoring. There is clearly some level of strategy, at least regarding open borders. At least I hope so. The apparent turmoil and chaos today are simply signs of things to come. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems, until such time as no one will take the money or it is simply of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2023 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.